The great being saith, the heaven of divine wisdom is illumined with the two luminaries of consultation and compassion. Take ye counsel together in all matters, inasmuch as consultation is the lamp of guidance which leadeth the way, and is the bestower of understanding. In all things it is necessary to consult. This matter should be forcibly stressed by thee, so that consultation may be observed by all. The intent of what hath been revealed from the pen of the Most High is that consultation may be fully carried out among the friends, inasmuch as it is and will always be a cause of awareness and of awakening and a source of good and well-being. Baha'u'llah. So today we're really happy to have Mr. Robert Ahdieh, and his topic is the changing dynamics of communication in America and the Baha'i perspective on consultation. Mr. Ahdieh is the Vice President for Professional Schools and Programs at Texas A&M University, Chief Operating Officer of Texas A&M-Fort Worth, and Dean of Texas A&M School of Law. A graduate of Radnor High School outside Philadelphia, and then Princeton University and Yale Law School, he has taught at Emory, Georgetown, and Columbia universities prior to coming to Texas A&M. He has published widely, including the leading book on constitutional transition in post-Soviet Russia. In this presentation, he will speak to the possibility and nature of world peace. So with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Mr. Ahdieh.
Thank you, Payman, and greetings to all of you friends. Thanks for being here on your Saturday morning or afternoon, depending on, I guess, where you are in the world. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, and then hopefully respond to questions about the topic. This is a topic that I'm keenly interested in, and I'll say this as a Baha'i. I'm deeply interested in as a law professor and a law dean. As I'll share a few words about that as well. And then, frankly, I'm worried about it as a citizen of the United States and a citizen of the world in terms of where we are and where we're going, in terms of the ability to communicate with others, individually, in groups, and ultimately as communities and societies, and in our politics and in our countries and globally as well. I think we're at a moment of real potential inflection, and I think reflecting on or thinking about kind of what our communications might or should look like, and maybe offering the Baha'i perspective on that and what we might learn from it, I think maybe is an important undertaking at the moment. So let me begin with a few words about the Baha'i faith for those who are less familiar with it, and I will do that, but with an eye to sort of highlighting a few elements that we'll come back to later on in the conversation in terms of the way in which some of these core Baha'i principles are reflected in this dynamic of what we call as Baha'is consultation and its importance for us as Baha'is. So the Baha'i faith originates in the mid-19th century, in the mid-1800s in Iran. It emerges out of Islam the same way we might think of Christianity as having emerged out of Judaism. So its kind of roots are there, but it is an independent world religion with its own holy texts, its own prophet founder, its own teachings, which are understood to have abrogated or sort of brought into being a new set of rules and practices for humanity to abide by and live by. Although it originates in Iran because of, in many ways, the kind of very global-minded teachings of the Baha'i faith, it really has spread globally. So it is the most, depending on how you get, or one of the most globally widespread religions in the world. If you look at the number of nation states where Baha'is reside and practice, and so it really has become in many ways a global religion. In numbers, the Baha'is don't number huge numbers. Probably let's say 8-9 million around the entire world. Some concentration in a few large countries, but really, as I said, spread everywhere. The core principles of the Baha'i teaching, probably the most fundamental principle, and one that we'll be coming back to in our conversation, is the principle of unity. The notion that there is a critical need at the level of individuals, at the level of families, at the level of communities, cities, nation states, and the world to pursue this greater level of unity and harmony among us. Notably, though, the notion of unity for Baha'is that we talk about is the notion of unity and diversity. So the notion is that it's not unity through uniformity, that we're all the same, but rather that the diversity of, as we'll talk about later on, viewpoints, but the diversity of who we are as people is what gives rise to that, or that's the ground out of which the unity emerges. The metaphor that's oftentimes used is that of a garden. So you could have a unified garden because all the flowers, it's all flowers of one sort. But in some ways, the most beautiful garden is a garden that is unified in its design, and in its cohesion, but because it's comprised of flowers of an incredibly broad variety and scope and range and so on and so forth. So unity is this foundational principle that in many ways can be a prism really to understand so many other aspects of the Baha'i teachings. But some of the other kind of important ones that I would flag as well: equality. So various forms of equality. So the notion of the equality of women and men. Here, the metaphor that's used in the Baha'i writings is two wings of a bird. The notion that a bird can't fly if one wing is weaker than the other. And so we need both wings, that of the man and that of the woman, to be equally strong for the bird to be able to fly, for the bird to be able to rise. But also equality of races, the equality of, of all other sorts, even wealth and poverty, the notion that there should not be extremes of wealth and poverty. So there needs to be equality of that sort. Not uniformity again, but less disparity than we conventionally see. So equality and a commitment to overcoming prejudice is a central part of the Baha'i teachings. Related to that, I think, is the notion of the harmony of science and religion. So oftentimes we think of religion as being in tension with faith, so that you either have reason, science on one hand, or you have faith, and you have to pick between them. The notion for the Baha'is is that they're not mutually exclusive, that in essence, you need both reason, science, and faith, religion. Here, the reference we oftentimes use is the notion that science or reason without faith leads to materialism, and faith faith or spirit or religion without science and reason leads to fanaticism. So each of them is tempered by the other in ways that help us advance as a human community. So harmony of science and religion. Broad range of social teaching. I won't go into great detail, but Baha'is have principles about refraining from premarital sex. Baha'is don't drink. Baha'is don't take drugs. There are social teachings of this sort. And then there's all sorts of what I think of as kind of almost modernist. And if you think about the origin of the Baha'i faith in the mid-1800s, this was a kind of a period of the flourishing of the Enlightenment and the like. And so many of the teachings fit with that. I talked about this harmony of science and religion, but other principles also are of a piece with that. Hold on one second. I'm going to go close my door. I apologize. So harmony of science and religion, but other ones too. So, for example, there's the notion in the Baha'i teachings of a need to create an auxiliary universal language. Again, if you think of the principle of unity, the notion is that there should be some capacity for all of humanity to be able to communicate. Overcoming of illiteracy, right? That it's a priority for Baha'is, this notion that sort of all should be able to read and communicate in their own right. The creation of a common currency, so that there's the ability to trade and for resources to move freely around the world. So these are some of the operational, I'll call it, teachings in that we embrace. Two last ones that I'll mention. One is a lack of clergy. This isn't really a principle per se, but it's a characteristic of the Baha'i community that's worth emphasizing. So here the notion is that, this relates to the last one I'm going to mention, the notion of independent investigation of truth. And this also connects to the requirement of that all humanity have access to education and be literate. The notion is that we do not have a clergy that interprets the text for us. Each individual should have an education, should be literate, should be able to read the text and interpret for themselves how to apply that and what that means to them. We do have an administrative apparatus, which Again, if people have questions about that later, I'm happy to say more about that. But we have an elected administrative apparatus in the Baha'i community to govern the affairs of the community. But their task is distinct from a clergy in that their task is not, at least primarily, interpretive. It's not primarily to pastoral in the sense of here's what the text says, here's what that means for you, here's what you need to do with that. The notion is that individuals, through this independent investigation of truth, come to that themselves. The one other point to say about this notion of independent investigation of truth is that we don't have the notion that because someone's parents were Baha'is, they become Baha'is. So I, for example, have had a number of generations in the Baha'i faith, have embraced the Baha'i faith. But when I was of age, when I became a teenager, my parents made sure that I was exposed to the church, Christianity and the church, made sure I was exposed to Judaism and synagogue, made sure I was exposed to Islam and going to a mosque to see these and to sort of have some understanding of them with an eye to my then making a determination of was it the case that I wanted to embrace the Baha'i teachings myself. Okay, so that's a little bit of the kind of the background of the Baha'i faith and some of its core principles. I will come back to in the context of our topic today, the notion of unity, the notion of the absence or the meaning of the significance of the absence of a clergy, and then this notion of independent investigation of truth as being part and parcel of this notion of consultation or connected to this notion of consultation that we're focused on today. All right, so now let me step away from that to say, like, all right, begin with kind of the broad state of what I call discourse in our country, in the United States today, and perhaps you could say in the world, although I'm more over my skis when I talk about the rest of the world than I am as to the United States. So my focus is more on the United States than the rest of the world. So what's the state of discourse? And I'm going to talk about this at the level of the political dialogue and discourse, personal dialogue and discourse, and then, given my background, a little about law and legal education and legal practice as well. So first, the political discourse. So I think we all know from the news and from things we read that we are at a time of incredible political polarization. We see that in various visible forms, or that shows itself up in various visible forms. The underlying kind of, if we think about what characterizes that political polarization, it starts from ideological cohesion within our political parties. So historically, and the phrase we oftentimes have used for this in America is the notion of a big tent. We had political parties that were a big tent. So the idea was that people of a wide array of different views, shared enough in common that they all believe themselves to be Democrats, or all believe themselves to be Republicans, or all believe themselves to be something else. The size of that tent has shrunk over time with every party. Parties have become more and more ideologically cohesive. So if I say I'm a Republican, or I say I'm a Democrat, or I say I'm a member of the Green Party, my level of alignment with everyone else who says that has gone up dramatically. Okay, so there's this ideological cohesiveness to things that increases polarization, because it means that I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, just to take the two largest categories, tells you everything you need to know about me, right? And also tells me that I have nothing in common with you, because everyone in this group shares these views, and everyone in this group shares these views, and therefore there is an overlap. What that's meant in turn is the second feature, which is that they're further apart. So if you think about it, visually, if I've got two big tents, right, they are necessarily, because they're big, they get close to each other. The tail, if you think of it as a conservative Republican and a liberal, or sorry, a liberal Republican and a conservative Democrat are pretty close. But if you increase ideological cohesiveness and the tent gets smaller, now we're further apart. There is less overlap that we can utilize to kind of try and close the gap and find commonality and find agreement in that context. It also is the case that to a greater degree, and all these things are probably related, but to a greater degree in the past, the definition of being a member of Party X or political viewpoint Y is as much, or is to a greater degree, about my dislike of the other than it is my enthusiasm about my own views. And you can see how that increases polarization, because now it's not, I'm just excited about this, but I get it. You're excited about what you're excited about your thing, right? I hear you. On the other hand, if the definition of what I believe is, or what we believe is, we don't like you, if that's a predominant part of it or a central part of it, that makes it that much more difficult for us to find opportunity and capacity to communicate. Okay, so extreme polarization is kind of the order of the day in some sense. And again, all these things, it's hard to say cause and effect, although I will in a few minutes talk some about why this might be happening. But a second manifestation of it is in our rhetoric. So our rhetoric today is dramatically more thing, and there's all sorts of linguists and political theorists who kind of are looking at this and talking about the way, the terms we use, the adjectives we use, even the nouns we use to describe those with whom we disagree are dramatically more loaded than they were even 5, 10 years ago, let alone 15, 20, 30 years ago, right? I fundamentally disagree with my respected colleague from Connecticut, right? Is very different than my colleague hates America, right? Or hates freedom, right? Or wants to destroy our country, right? Let alone my colleague is a fascist, or for that matter, my colleague, is a anarchist who wants to bring down the country, or whatever it might be. So our rhetoric has taken on a edge that I think is aggravated the negative of our state of discourse today in politics. All of that in turn has given rise in the political context to extreme dysfunction. We are literally living that right now, around the shutdown of the federal government. Even the words with which, the way it's characterized, we see it, but the very fact of it, right? And with all the problems it creates for so many, is a reflection of that. You also see it in vote counts. And I'll give you in my law world. Previously, historically, when judges were nominated to the federal bench, on average, there were exceptions, but on average, the judges who were approved with 80 to 90 out of 100 votes in the Senate. Now, if you can get 54 votes or 53 votes, that's considered to be a hugely out of 100. That's considered to be a pretty substantial success, right? And we see that with so many, even the most important pieces of legislation these days will oftentimes go through with 51 votes from the Senate, 51 votes, 52 votes, 53 votes, rather than with 60 or 70 or 80 or 90, right? So the manifestation of this inability to communicate in the political climate is things like the shutdown, obviously, but also just the day-to-day, the way in which we legislate, the way in which we act now is filtered through this lens of polarization in a way that we can't get something, win past something by an overwhelming margin in the way that we once did. So what about then the personal level? So that's politics. And we might say, well, politics is always like that. Our politics is terrible and they're a bunch of savages or whatever else it is. But in our personal lives, not so much. But it turns out in our personal lives, it's true as well. So what's happened is that our political identities, in many ways, and this isn't the only issue, but one aspect of it is our political identities have translated into our social identities. Okay, so what we believe politically has come to define who we are socially as well, right? Who we talk to, who we don't talk to. It impacts who we read, what we read, right? So we read different things if we believe X, Y, and Z than if we believe A, B, and C. The degree of this struck me when one of my boys sent me a link to a news website. That's like a news aggregator. It pulls news from different sites. And then what it does is, I don't know, we're using AI or something, every article, or not every article, I think the news source, it sorts it by its politics and not with a label. Instead, it's in this publication, 70% of the articles are conservative leaning, 20% are liberal leaning, and 10% are neutral. And then another article from another site is 70% of their articles are liberal leaning, 20% are this, whatever else it is. The notion that these are news stories, these are not opinions, these are news stories, but that we have to filter it through that becomes problematic, especially given that most people don't go to that website. They only go to the website where they find they find sympathetic voices, where they find what they agree with. We call this in cognitive psychology confirmation bias, right? We only read the things that align with what we believe, which makes us believe them even more, right? Because everything I read suggests X or Y or Z to me. It impacts who we talk to. So remember, there used to be the thing we would talk about that at Thanksgiving dinner, there was that uncle who had their crazy views and how you dealt with it, whatever else it is. It turns out every day is Thanksgiving now, right? We are in a constant world in which we are navigating, and we are fighting over this, over these kind of conflicts and disagreements. In families and across our lives. There was an article or book I don't remember recently that was called "The Big Sort." Was the name of it, and the argument that the author made was that geographically people are moving by state, by city versus rural, and even within suburban communities to places where everyone agrees with them, right? So even where we live increasingly is aligned with not just what we read, not just who we choose to talk to, but everyone around us is in alignment, is in agreement with us. So even in our personal lives, we are seeing this closing down of communication, this closing down of dialogue and discourse in a way that kind of limits what we are exposed to, what we hear. So now let me translate that to the world in which I live, of law, legal education, and legal practice. So there's a thing that we used to talk about. In theory, we still talk about it, but we don't mention it as much. That we'd say, even the most forceful advocates in the courtroom, of lawyers in the courtroom, afterwards the two lawyers go out and get a beer together. And the notion that was meant to capture was the idea that, like, look, of course, in the courtroom, we are zealously representing the interests of our clients and doing so in a forceful fashion. However, that doesn't mean that we are in personal conflict with one another, that we dislike one another, that we can't speak to one another, that we can't engage one another in this way. If you think fundamentally about what we teach in law school, we talk about what we teach in law school is how to think like a lawyer. We mean a lot of things in that, but probably the most important thing we mean is that our role as a lawyer is to identify for all comers, the judge, our client, opposing counsel, so on and so forth, the community at large, the fact that there is dramatically more gray than there is black or white. There is some black and white, without question. But if you look at most complex problems, there's dramatically more gray than there is either black or white. That's what lawyers. That's when we talk about think like a lawyer. That's what we're teaching them. We're trying to teach them in law school. It's one of the reasons people get annoyed with lawyers, like our parents. We drive them crazy. Because again, even the seemingly most simple thing, the lawyer says, "Well, but wait a minute, what about the other side?" Or says, "Well, it depends," right? But that's really what a lawyer is doing at a fundamental level. Notably, that's not a new thing. Alexis de Tocqueville was this French commentator on early American colonial and then independent post-revolution America. And he wrote Democracy in America, was his famous book that he wrote. And one of the things he talks about at great length is the role of lawyers in American society. And he says exactly this, that lawyers play this leavening influence of kind of making sure people understand that there are two sides to the story, that there's, again, more gray than black. It also has shown up historically in practice. So what we used to talk about lawyers as the counselor. This was someone's counselor, right? So what does that mean to counsel someone? To counsel someone means that you provide advice and counsel, which of necessity means oftentimes telling someone something they don't want to hear, right? We would talk about the head of a company, at the end of the day, would sit down with their counselor, their lawyer, and say, "Okay, here's what I'm thinking about doing." The lawyer would say, "Okay, well, look, here's the pros, here's the cons, or here's the challenges, here's the whatever else it is." The best lawyers, the way I say it to my students is I say, the very best lawyers are those who are the best lawyer on both sides of the case. That if you walk in a courtroom and you are representing one side and the judge says, "You know what, just for fun, let's switch it around and have you represent the other side, each of you represent the other side," you'll still win because you know the other side's case better than they know it, right? So that's really, again, the kind of the ideal that we have aspired to in lawyers. But my fear is we're losing that. If I look at our students, we now have, for every student group that has view X, we have one that has view Y. That might be okay, except that They also don't engage one another. They don't jointly do events. They don't attend one another's events. No, I don't want to over exaggerate. To a lesser degree than they did, do they attend one another's events, engage one another, talk to one another, so on and so forth. In classes, it used to be the case that we could readily expect that students would, with relative ease say, well, I hear you, but I disagree with you for the following reasons. Students are more hesitant to do that because, again, they don't want conflict, and they think of it as, if I disagree with someone or something someone said, that may generate conflict. So all of these are windows into, at the political level, at the personal level, and then this separate area of law and legal practice, the ways in which we see this decline of substantial, meaningful, deep discourse between individuals in recent years. Why is this happening? I'll say a few minutes about this. We oftentimes blame social media, and I think there's some truth to that. Literally, the algorithm in social media is designed to give you what you want, not what you don't want, right? Not what you don't want to hear, not what you don't want to see, right? So if I am a regular user, if I'm an active user of social media, over time it learns what it is that I'm more likely to read. It learns what it is that I pause on longer, and it gives me more of that. And as it does that, of course, I focus more on those things. And so it gives me more of that, and not just more of it in volume, such that I only am hearing or seeing or reading those things, but also more in terms of more forceful, or whatever you want to call it, more aggressive, more virulent forms of that. So social media for sure is a contributing factor to why we're seeing this phenomenon. But in some ways, that only is the case, or that's only true in part because of changes in traditional media. So again, some of you are too young to remember this, but once upon a time, the whole country would sit there and close their eyes or open their eyes at 6 p.m., 6:30 p.m. and watch the same guy, Walter Cronkite, deliver the news. And nobody had any notion that Walter Cronkite was delivering this news versus that news, or news with this spin, or whatever. This is the news, right? We had a finite number of channels, right? The 3 channels basically that you could watch, and so you choose one of those and you'd watch those, and all of those were fairly middle of the road as a matter of where they got their advertising, and therefore how they articulated what they were doing. But as we grew the number of venues through which knowledge, information, media, etc., was communicated, the content also changed. It turned out it was, you can have that market, I'll take this market. And now if somebody continues to narrowcast where they get their information, right, so that they're following only this one source or this one conduit, it means that they're going to get not biased, and biased only in the sense of self-selected biased information, or information only on one side versus the other. The analogy to this that I drew for someone recently was, I lived for a period of time in the late Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union collapses. And I told people U.S. media in many ways has become like Soviet media. Now, what do I mean by that? So Pravda was the Soviet newspaper. It was Izvestia as well, but Pravda was the main one. And Pravda means truth in Russian. And Russians made all sorts of jokes about it. And what I said is, like, if you went and read Pravda, they weren't, at least for the most part, lying. But they were being selective about what they did and didn't report. And they described the things that they reported in a particular way, right? Collectively, thus, if you actually rely on that, you would become misinformed over time, because huge swaths of other information, countervailing information, was being left out, and you were getting it exaggerated. That's in essence what we have done with American media as well, which in some ways then has laid the groundwork for social media to do what it has done. A broader phenomenon that I'd mention as well is general isolation, social isolation. So tons of data now about this. COVID made it worse, but it predates COVID. Our phones are a major contributing factor to this, right? I can live an incredibly full life with this phone, right? I can talk to millions of people in all parts of the world. I can see incredible things, whatever else it is, all without actually interacting with another human being. Robert Putnam is a sociologist at Harvard. wrote a book now many years ago called Bowling Alone, Bowling Alone. And his general premise was that what has happened in America is that the nature of social activity, nature of activity by people has become less and less social over time. So one of the data points that he tracked was the percentage of bowlers, so people who bowl, what percentage of them bowl in a league or a member of a league. And he showed over decades in America the percentage that were in a league going down. Now, the percentage that were bowling has also gone down, but not proportionately. So, in other words, the proportion, there were, I'm making these numbers up, but 1 million people used to bowl. Now it's 800,000 people. But of that 800,000, with 1 million, 900,000 used to bowl in a league. Of the 800,000, only 200,000 bowl in a league. Again, the numbers are made up because I don't know the exact numbers. But he titles the book "Bowling Alone" to say we have changed our patterns of behavior. And this is all before cell phones. He writes that book. With cell phones, it's become even more exaggerated. Younger generation and older generations alike that we've seen that pattern. Now, a bit of good news on that regard, I'll say, is that I happened to take my daughter bowling recently, and the guy who was managing the place is weirdly the guy who manages league participation for the National Bowling League in the United States. And so I made a comment to him about this, and he said, "Oh, the good news is in the last several years, so this is not immediately post-COVID, but like the last 2 years, so the later, a little bit more recent in the post-COVID period, they've actually begun to see an increase in the numbers. So who knows? Maybe there's hope. But that social isolation, I think, is another contributing factor to be conscious of. In politics, likewise, we have things happening as well. Gerrymandering is in the news a great deal right now, redistricting and the like. So you basically design districts so that you know X is going to win. Because you know X is going to win, there is no reason for the relevant legislator to in any way modulate their views. To the contrary, if they are in any way moderate, they will lose in a primary election, right? Which becomes really the final election, because a Republican can't win in this district and a Democrat can't win in this district. So the primary is really the whole deal. And in that primary, where only members of one party vote, being more extreme, for all the reasons we've talked about, is what wins. So that's contributive. And then media has layered on top of that, because the way the media talks about politics aggravates this as well. And so there's that as well. And the last one I'll say in terms of the why is, if we look at public opinion polling, there is a general decline in trust in the United States that we have seen over the last 20, 30 years. And if you have declining trust in institutions, you're going to have declining trust in the institutions through which communication happens. And as a result, we're going to see this decline in communication. Okay, so against that backdrop then, now what I want to spend the rest of our time talking about is this Bahá'í notion of consultation. And again, thinking about how it might be offer, at least in some ways, an antidote or a countervailing conception of how we engage this world in which we're navigating. So here I want to use some passages from the Bahá'í writings as well, to capture some of what I want to convey in that regard, on a couple of different aspects. So first, the Bahá'í notion of the importance of consultation. So if you think about that, everything I've described to you to this point is all about the ways in which dialogue and discourse are on the decline, or meaningful dialogue discourse are on the decline. The Bahá'í perspective is that is a big problem, that consultation, this kind of communication engagement, is critically important. So two brief passages on this. No man can attain, and man meant humanity generally, no man can attain his true station except through his justice. No power can exist except through unity. No welfare, this is the important one, no welfare and no well-being can be attained except through consultation. It's quite a concept. I'll read that last sentence again. No welfare and no well-being can be attained except through consultation. And a second passage, and these two are both from Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, our prophet, our manifestation of God for the Baha'i teachings. So the second passage, the heaven of divine wisdom is illumined with the two luminaries of consultation and compassion. I'm going to read it again. The heaven of divine wisdom is illumined with the two luminaries of consultation and compassion. So again, the two most important things, consultation and compassion. Take ye counsel together in all matters, inasmuch as consultation is the lamp of guidance which leadeth the way and is the bestower of understanding. So for Baha'is, to begin, this notion of consultation, dialogue, discourse, and what we talk about consultation is not a wouldn't it be nice? It is fundamental to the health, well-being, survival of humanity, right? Again, no welfare, no well-being can be achieved without it. There are two things in the heaven of wisdom, divine wisdom: consultation and compassion. That suggests, again, a critical role for that, one that can't really be overstated. So what then does it mean to engage in consultation? Again, two passages that I wanna read for you. The first one, they must then proceed. This is in terms of how do we consult? Like, what does it mean to consult, and what does that look like? They must then proceed with the utmost devotion, courtesy, dignity, care, and moderation to express their views. So the utmost devotion, courtesy, dignity, care, and moderation in expressing their views. They must in every matter search out the truth and not insist upon their own opinion. For stubbornness and persistence in one's views will lead ultimately to discord and wrangling, and the truth will remain hidden. The honored members of any group must with all freedom express their own thoughts, and it is in no wise permissible for one to belittle the thought of another. Nay, he must with moderation set forth the truth. So that's one description of kind of how we go about, what it means to engage in true consultation, true dialogue through true discourse. The second one, again, in a similar vein. The members thereof must take counsel together in such wise that no occasion for ill feeling or discord may arise. This can be attained when every member expresseth with absolute freedom his own opinion and setteth forth his argument. Should anyone oppose, he must on no account feel hurt, for not until matters are fully discussed can the right way be revealed. And this I'll read twice, but this last sentence: the shining spark of truth cometh forth only after the clash of differing opinions. The shining spark of truth cometh forth only after the clash of differing opinions. So how we do consultation is important. It's not just we should talk to each other, although that's true too. But how we do it is important. There should be no restraint on views. It should be the case. It's not, there is no notion that, like, don't say that because people may not want to hear it, or people may not agree with you, or people may not like it. There should be this expectation that all feel free to share, to express their views. But it is critically important that we not be attached to our views, that when we share our views, we are putting ideas on the table for the entire group. They're not our ideas anymore. They're not our viewpoints, our positions, our opinions. They're a contribution to the consultation from which others may draw, not draw, draw in part, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the way we have to think about it. We have a tendency, and this is human nature probably at some level, to defend it, to say, no, let me explain my idea again, or let me clarify it, or let me make sure you understand why my approach is correct. Also critically important to the success of consultation is how we express what we have to, what we want to convey. We have to express it, but express it not in a way that is judgmental of others, not in a way that is a commentary on them versus on the ideas, not in a way that's attacking. What's the result of that? We hope is that we get to truth. And here I think at its best, we'd like to believe as lawyers, as law professors, as law deans, that that's what happens in the legal system. That the legal system at its best is this clash of opinions. One side expresses their views, another side expresses their views, and then what emerges out of that is the truth, right? We approach the truth. Another passage, a little bit longer, forgive me for this, but I think one that conveys kind of this aspiration. The purpose is to emphasize the statement that consultation must have for its object the investigation of truth. He who expresses an opinion should not voice it as correct and right, but set it forth as a contribution to the consensus of opinion. For the light of reality becomes apparent when two opinions coincide. A spark is produced when flint and steel come together. Man should weigh his opinions with the utmost serenity, calmness, and composure. Before expressing his own views, he should carefully consider the views already advanced by others. If he finds that a previously expressed opinion is more true and worthy, he should accept it and immediately and not willfully hold to an opinion of his own. By this excellent method, he endeavors to arrive at unity and truth. Opposition and division are deplorable. It is better then to have the opinion of a wise, sagacious man. Otherwise, contradiction and altercation, in which varied and divergent views are presented, will make it necessary for a judicial body to render decision upon the question. Even a majority opinion or consensus may be incorrect. 1,000 people may hold to one view and be mistaken, whereas one sagacious person may be right. Therefore, true consultation is spiritual conference in the attitude and atmosphere of love. Members must love each other in the spirit of fellowship in order that good results may be forthcoming. Love and fellowship are the foundation. So beyond any aspect of process, that passage suggests to us that love is central to this. Now, that love, you could imagine, takes various forms. It could take the form of, I love the person I'm talking to. It could be that I love this, the process, or I love it. It could be love of country or love of, community, that I love the community. And that's what's motivating me, is I want to make it better. I want to make our community, our state, our city, our nation, our world better, and that drives that. This dynamic of consultation, in terms of context, of course, can show itself in institutional context, but it can also show up in the individual level. It can show up in the form of how it is that we go about interacting with our fellow man. It's not that I think every conversation has to take the form of consultation, but it can, right? Or it can have aspects of that in it. What then is the aspiration of this model of consultation? First, I would not understate, and I want to say a quick word about this element of independent investigation of truth. So if that's what we are trying to accomplish, this principle is the independent investigation of truth, this is a good way to do it, right? We're going to engage, we're going to put ideas on the table, multiple ideas. We're going to engage them in a fair and non-confrontational, non-hostile, we'll call it, fashion. And that's going to enable us to sort of, as individuals within that group, approximate the truth. But also, and perhaps in some tension with that, is this emphasis on unity that we heard in that last passage. And I'm going to read the last quote that I'll read on this topic of unity and its fundamental importance. This is the quote: "If they agree on a subject, even though it be wrong, it is better than to disagree and be in the right. For this difference will produce the demolition of the divine foundation. Though one of the parties may be in the right and they disagree, that will be the cause of 1,000 wrongs. But if they agree and both parties are wrong, as it is in unity, the truth will be revealed and the wrong made right." So that even where consultation produces the wrong result, because it produces unity, that creates the environment, the setting, the process, the structures in which we can accomplish, in which we can achieve unity thereafter. Last thing, because I know we're at time, the time for my portion before we turn to questions. How do we think then about how this all comes together? How do we put all these pieces together? So this is my interpretation, I should emphasize. But if we think about what will make for effective consultation, and in turn then how we might apply that in our individual lives, in our community lives, in the lives of the organizations we're part of, and ultimately, we hope, in our political lives. A first step is prayer and spiritual preparation. And I say this regardless of one's religious beliefs or so on and so forth. This isn't a Baha'i prayer or even a prayer of that sort. But I do think the spiritual preparation of approaching the conversation with humility, approaching it with openness, approaching it with detachment, setting aside one's ego and one's personal attachment, not trying to win an argument. All of these lie in some notion of there is something greater than myself. There is some bigger power, however one might define that, that is at work. So this prayerful, spiritual, other regarding kind of perception or approach, I think, is one important piece. A clear definition of the problem. Very often, consultation fails or dialogue is difficult to accomplish because if we're not actually talking about the same issue. We seem to be talking about the same issue, but really what I'm talking about is X, and really what you're talking about is Y, and that makes it hard for us to sort of engage in meaningful conversation. So clarity in terms of what we're actually discussing. As we said earlier, the opportunity for free and frank expression of ideas, that people have to feel that they can openly share what they have to say. Of course, to do so in a respectful fashion, with honesty, with courtesy, so on and so forth. But they can express those, and criticism has its place, right? So that people should feel free to criticize as well, but not the individual, but rather the ideas, which are not their ideas anymore. They're ideas that we're engaging as a group. Detached and truth-seeking mindset. Again, from those patches, we heard that. The idea that we're going to examine ideas objectively. We're trying to get to the truth, not winning. I don't come to the conversation with, this is the right answer. Let me see if I can convince them. Instead, we're trying to get to the truth, which may be what I'm saying, maybe a version of what I'm saying, or maybe the opposite of what I'm saying. I have to approach it with that mindset. So participants in any consultation of this sort, broader discourse of this sort, have to feel free to change their opinions freely without embarrassment, so on and so forth. And finally, a system for decision-making. Ideally, our aspiration, I think, should be decision-making by consensus. If we can reach a consensus as a group, including given this principle of unity, including given this principles of detachment, that's great. But also we have to have systems by which a majority vote then prevails. And once that happens, that becomes the decision of the whole group. The group has now decided that, and all with full enthusiasm and support and wholehearted, receptivity, then supports that decision. Because otherwise, it distorts the consultation itself if we know that the dissenter is going to go out and say, well, I don't believe in this, or I'm not going to support it because of what it looked like. Again, I think that obviously has applications in certain settings, but I think maybe the lesson that I hope we kind of come away with is that there is real opportunity to apply that in all sorts of aspects of our individual families, with our spouses, with our families as a whole, our children, with our broader families, in our schools and our communities. And ultimately, the hope is if we can model this and practice it individually and then in small groups, ultimately it begins to shift the patterns of engagement, the patterns of conversation that we are seeing nationally and otherwise as well. Okay, let me stop there and happy to answer questions that folks have.
How do you wisely deal with a situation when you want to practice the art of consultation while your opponent's goal isn't searching for truth, but dominating to feel better about themselves?
Good. So obviously, again, all of these things work better with mutuality, almost everything, right? In other words, it's much easier to be honest when you're talking to someone who's honest and also honest. And it's much easier to be civil when the other side is being civil. but as we know, that's a heroic assumption to make in the world in general. In so many settings, I think we recognize that if my child came home from school and said with a report that they had punched another kid, the answer that they punched me first, it's not a great answer, right? I mean, I would say to my kid, look, yes, but could you have then walked away, or could you have gone and told the teacher, or could you have done something? So there's lots of settings in which we recognize that although ideally, the first punch wouldn't have happened, one could avoid a return punch, right? Okay, so, but in this setting, it does somehow feel like it's the nature of dialogue and conversation that there is a need for mutuality. I think there's probably some truth in that, And probably one lesson to one important element of this is to know when to walk away, right? When someone is not engaged in good faith dialogue, it's probably unhealthy both for them and you to continue the conversation. And it's appropriate to say, like, I don't think this is a productive conversation right now. I'm happy to take it up at another time, but right now I don't think we're going to make a lot of progress. So I think that has its place. So I don't want to understate that. That said, I also wouldn't underestimate the degree to which modeling behavior positively impacts the behavior of others. We see that in all sorts of settings, right? Where it's a lot harder to have the approach that you described in the question of the other party. If the response is even inquiring, engaging, respectful, courteous, so on and so forth. That's especially true, I think, where this is happening in a collective setting, right? We are not 100% of us, but 99.99% of humanity, we are sensitive to the response of others to our behavior. So if I'm in a conversation with you and there's others around or others part of the conversation, and you're being respectful, and I'm responding with hostility and anger and disrespect and lack of courtesy and so on and so forth, and I see the response of that from the group, my guess is for that reason alone, I will begin to modulate and align. And we hope you do that enough and it becomes, oh, I can actually have a conversation like this. But my guess is that even one-on-one, there's more of that than we might imagine, right? It doesn't happen instantly, like everything difficult in life, but I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which thing. But again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. But are there times when the right response is to walk away, to say, like, I don't think we're not going to make headway? I think so. I think that's probably appropriate too. And maybe, again, well advised, because sometimes dialogue doesn't just move you in the right direction. Unhealthy dialogue can move you in the wrong direction. I mean, we know that there's conversations that come to blows, right? Have the expression, right? Those conversations probably would have been well to end sooner, right? Rather than carrying them on until they came to blows.
Thank you. What is the difference between supporting a decision and agreeing with it?
Great. So I'll say this as a lawyer, again, we live and die by this, right? So again, a court has made a decision, right? There's mechanisms, there's appeals, there's so on and so forth. But once a decision is made, as a lawyer, I don't do my client any favors to say, let's just ignore the decision, right? Okay, so that's one aspect of it. Is that, again, look, it is the case that decision has been made. It's rarely the case that it's constructive to undermine it in the sense of you are not going to successfully undermine it, and meanwhile you will do harm to your own kind of. But I think actually the Baha'i notion, I think, is a more fundamental one. I think it's that you should embrace that, and this is where the unity piece comes into it. You should embrace that the capacity of whatever the community is, me and my spouse, my nuclear family, my extended family, the neighborhood I live in, the city I live in, the state or country I live in, the ability of that community to realign onto the right path, or what I perceive to be the right path, is dramatically greater if the dialogue continues, if the conversation continues, if there is thoughtful attention to our continued existence and operation as a unit of some sort. Again, whether husband and wife, family, city, country, whatever. So I do think, again, that requires that it not be just, look, it's the rule, what the hell? I mean, I think it's stupid, but we got to live with it. But instead, look, this is a decision that's been made. Let's make the best of it. And if it needs to change over time, I have every confidence that we as a community, we as a family, we as a country, we as a state, whatever else it is, have the capacity to be able to adjust course and shift to that better decision, right? I think that's the form in my mind. I've never thought of it, I'll say, I've never thought of it as I have to lie and say, there's no question in my mind the decision is correct. But that really is much more about the winning mindset than anything else, right? We have some notion that I didn't win on this, but it wasn't a win thing. It was, we were trying to approximate truth. This was the group's kind of effort to do so. I don't have to, the world doesn't need to know where I was on that issue or where I am on that issue, right? To the extent to which I think we currently believe. That some of that is just our general, I hate to say it this way, but kind of self-centeredness, maybe in America particularly, but probably in the West generally, that it's, like, I need you to know my views on this issue, which, most of the time, who cares what your views are, right? Not really that consequential, but we feel the need that, the world has to know it, so it's a good place. So that would be my thought.
What do you think Baha'u'llah meant when he said that we must root out conflict when both parties may be oppressed by trauma and dysfunction?
Read it one more time.
What do you think Baha'u'llah meant when he said that we must root out conflict when both parties may be oppressed by trauma and dysfunction?
Interesting. Well, let me. I'm going to try to give it some thoughts, and if I don't get it, then whoever asks will follow up. So look, so I do think that in any structure you put in place, whether for communication, consultation, discourse dialogue, for electoral, for other kinds of decision making, it's important to be sensitive to and conscious of the relevant context or background with which folks come to the table, right? So for example, it's going to be the case that certain populations, whether by dint of their particularized experience or the category in which they are, whether that's women in a conversation, whether it's underrepresented minorities, may not come to the consultation with the same level of comfort in executing on, feel free to speak freely and share your views, right? The thing. Why? Because that has not been their lived experience. And so I do think smart and thoughtful consultation, dialogue, discourse has to reflect that, right? Or mature, maybe what I'd say is, has to reflect that. We've got to acknowledge the fact that people come to the table as who they are, and we have to have structures and systems in place to do that. So that's one thought that comes to mind from the question. A second piece that I'd say is that, apropos of conflict, like there is a risk in if we don't take seriously that part about people should feel free and open to share their views and shouldn't be attacked for it. There's a real risk that again, I would say the consultation can make things worse, right? Because it reinforces okay, well, I said my views and they got shot down, and so next time, why do that? Why should I be a part of it? And again, as the question asked, that could be true of all the parties, right? In which case, then it becomes, I don't know whether it's those who are putting in place the structure or those who are party to it, to say, let's acknowledge what that is. And that comes to mind again. You can imagine that some of this is, I think we're better about this, although I don't think we've really quite gotten it right. Acknowledging our biases, acknowledging our backgrounds, right? I think is important, right? We talk about this a lot in mediation, right? The patterns of mediation, that you start off in a mediation, you start off with, look, here are my priors that I'm starting from. You can imagine that that's potentially an important component in the settings that the questioner is asking about as well. Those would be a few thoughts.
Thank you. In interpersonal cases, how do the Baha'i teachings balance remaining silent in the face of attacks and accusations with the ego-ridden attackers who may view silence as weakness?
So, well, then one more time.
In interpersonal cases, how do the Baha'i teachings balance remaining silent in the face of attacks and accusations with the ego-ridden attackers who may view silence as weakness?
So again, a little bit that I think probably goes to sort of the earlier notion of do we believe that again, exposure therapy, for lack of a better word, that like if I am consistently responding to that ego-ridden attacker in a certain way, does that begin to break down their pattern or alter their patterns of behavior? I think it does, and I think it particularly does if those are part of some collective. So that could suggest, and the point of this is that even in interpersonal cases, doing it in a setting in which there is a broader circle of dialogue beyond the immediate parties to it may be important, right? Because in those settings, the ego-ridden attacker is, I hope, perhaps most of the time, maybe the likely to modulate or adjust their behavior. I do think, again, I'm repeating myself a little bit. Like, I do think there's places where it's not there's not a place for it. It's not that I don't think the principle always applies, but in practice, there's times when, and as Baha'is, obviously we believe this, there's a place for lawyers, right? There's a place for judges. There's a place for all sorts of external structures. So I don't see consultation as a magic bullet. That in all situations, if only we try to consult, that's all. Because sometimes it doesn't work because somebody is not capable of on the other side doing that. I also want to say, like, because the interpersonal can capture different things. There are all sorts of settings in which, as a matter of personal safety, as a matter of personal dignity, even beyond safety, I think that the structure, we have to tailor the structure to that. And it may be that consultation still has a place, but the consultation may take a different form, right? It may take the form of, I hate to say it this way, but I'm speaking through my lawyer, right? It may take the form of, I'm speaking in some structured fashion in which I speak and then you speak, as opposed to a setting in which allows the ego, the attack, to play itself out.
Thank you. So I think that's all of our questions. So thank you so much, Mr. Ahdieh, for your talk and for giving us your time today. We really appreciate it.
Of course. It was great to be with you all.
Thank you. And our speaker next week will be Dr. Shahram Ayubzadeh, and his talk will be Levels of Existence and Consciousness, a Baha'i Perspective. So these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I put the link to our mailing list and our YouTube channel in the chat so you can subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Have a nice week. Bye.